Hello, everyone. My name is Tess, and thank you so much for joining us for this session of Justice in Action. I'm with the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. This is a weekly conversation series we're doing with Ruth Messenger, the JCC social justice activist in residence, and Brad Lander, New York City Council member. Each week, we're meeting to discuss a different social justice issue and the ways that it's being exacerbated by COVID-19. This week, we're kicking off the first of two sessions covering educational inequities in New York City. New York City schools are often segregated with varying amounts of inadequate funding. And because of COVID-19, classes have entirely been moved online. There are now challenges including access to Wi-Fi and computers, relearning how to learn online, all while coping with the stress and trauma of living through a pandemic. To talk about this, we're incredibly honored to be joined by Khary Lazarre-White, co-founder of the Brotherhood Sister Sol, a Harlem-based youth development and educational organization, and Jose Luis Vilson, a math teacher in Inwood and Washington Heights and co-founder of EduColor, an organization dedicated to race and social justice issues in education. One quick note, while we're committed to hosting this conversation series, the views and opinions expressed throughout the conversation don't necessarily represent the policy or positions of the GCC or our co-hosts. And as a note, we really encourage you guys to participate throughout the conversation. Any questions that come up throughout, you can put it in the chat or the Q&A box. If you put your mouse on the screen where you see our faces, you'll see the Q&A and chat box. Either one works, and feel free to engage with us throughout the whole conversation. And here's Brad. Hi, Brad. We just kicked it off, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Ruth.
Okay, so I'm going to start. I've already told Khary and Jose that Brad and I would really mostly like to hear them talk. Tell all of you their story. Tell all of the audience your stories from before COVID, but your stories now and your sense of how to address these issues moving forward. That said, I'm actually going to take 1 minute and call on Brad, who's been engaged on the front lines in New York City more recently than I have, although I like to feel I'm still doing some frontline work. But Brad, tell us how education inequity looks to you as a member of the city council in your district, in your borough, in the city, and then pivot to either Jose or Khary to start talking about themselves.
That's great, and I'm really honored to be here and to hear both Khary and Jose, who I'm big fans of from like social media and Twitter and their work, but have not had the chance to actually meet, either in person or on Zoom yet. So I'm really honored, and I do mostly want to listen. Next week for our part 2 of educational justice as part of this series that Ruth and I are doing on COVID, we're going to have two folks who one in Brooklyn, who I've had some more chance to work with actively, Mark Winston Griffith, who runs the Brooklyn Movement Center and does work in District 16 and produced the incredible School Colors podcast, which if you have a little podcast listening time between now and next week, School Colors starts from the Ocean Hill-Brownsville, well, even earlier than that, but it really uses Brooklyn as a lens on systemic racism in the history of public education in New York and how to think about it. And, I think for the Jews on the call, obviously Ocean Hill-Brownsville has a set of things for us to look at. And Emma Rehak, who's a high school senior who lives in Harlem but goes to school on the Upper East Side, who's a member of Integrate NYC, which is the student wing of the school integration movement. They were supposed to be doing a big school strike on Monday, calling attention to ongoing segregation and educational inequity. And obviously everyone is school striking, I guess. But I haven't had a chance to focus as much on what's happening uptown. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I think it's just, here we are now 66 years after Brown versus Board of Education, when we said that the national rule was equality. And we said we would recognize that separate but equal was inherently unequal, and we have a fundamentally separate and equal school system in which we have neither succeeded in achieving meaningful educational equity by funding, by support for schools that are overwhelmingly color, nor have we succeeded in integrating our school system. Like, we have a separate and unequal school system 66 years after Brown. And we know that that reproduces inequality intergenerationally. And that's what we keep doing. And it's hard to have honest conversation about. I say that as a public school parent in Park Slope who has been able to send my kids to great public schools that I didn't have to pay tuition for, but that in many ways produced very disparate outcomes from public schools of color not far away from me. And it's hard to look at honestly, and the set of people that have been on the front lines in those schools and challenging those policies are real heroes. So these are, I guess I'll just end by saying, like, I find these hard conversations to have because of how embedded I am and we are in them. You know, when we're talking about like food inequities, that is terrible that people are starving or in emergency food lines, but you don't feel like the food you're eating is coming out of somebody else's mouth quite so directly. In our public school system, like it really is like that. Like my children have benefited from a system that is structurally advantages upper middle class white folks' ability to give their kids a good education and systemically deprives kids of color and low income kids of that. And so that makes it hard. And I think we want to find ways to have that conversation that are honest, that involve listening, you know, but that make room for everybody to try to show up in making change. So I'm really enthusiastic to be part of this conversation, mindful of the challenges it would have been before the COVID crisis and how much those are amplified by the digital divide and the very difficult challenges of delivering now. So I guess, Khary, let me ask you to start, but I'm really enthusiastic to hear from you.
Brad and Khary, I'm interrupting only to say three things. One is I remember the Brown versus Board of Ed decision. Two, I was already teaching and working in education, community education at the time of Ocean Hill-Brownsville, but on the west side of Manhattan. And three is I am the happy parent of 3 graduates of the New York City public school system. Go ahead, take it away. Khary?
I mean, I think
your life story in a minute.
Oh, my life story in a minute to start there. Okay. Well, how about we'll start just, briefly with an overview of Brotherhood Sister Sol and what we do, and as opposed to my life story, but maybe we'll return to my life story later. Brotherhood Sister Sol is celebrating our, excuse me? Can you hear me okay, Brad and Jose? Okay, Ruth froze. I just want to make sure. So Brotherhood Sister Sol is a comprehensive social justice youth development organization. We're based in Harlem. We're celebrating our 25th year right now. We provide comprehensive wraparound supports for young people, everything from the food that Brad talked about, normally 12,000 meals a year, to intensive rites of passage programming, helping young people define a moral and ethical code. What does it mean to be men and women, leaders, brothers and sisters in their community? At our best, our aspirational goal is to be the SNCC of today. We want to be the group that's teaching young people to be political leaders, to be voices for change. And I think the evidence has shown that we do a really wonderful job of that. We're also providing international study opportunities for young people to study with us in Africa and Latin America, college guidance, really wraparound supports. But because of the kind of inequities that Brad is talking about, it's also about providing emergency mental health support and legal representation and support in our schools. One of the most damaging statistics that I often cite is the fact that of high school graduates in New York City, so just those who graduate, only 1 out of 3 are prepared to go to BMCC without the need of remedial support. So we are failing hundreds of thousands of young people in their education, and that's the space we step into to help young people to overcome those realities. We also train educators on our model across the country. That's the second leg of the stool, and we've helped build several schools in New York with our model embedded in them. And then the third is that we're working to try to change the conditions. We want to change the conditions our young people are forced to endure. And so we tackle issues around economic inequality, around educational access, and around criminal justice. Those are the 3 main areas that we work within. Our young people have been at the forefront of a lot of social change movements in the city, most notably the effort to reform stop and frisk, a discredited, unconstitutional, racist practice of 2 administrations. And our young people were named litigants and witnesses. Nicholas Pert, one of our alumni, wrote the definitive op-ed on the piece, Why is the NYPD After Me? Mayor de Blasio said it changed his entire perspective on the issue. Unfortunately, I don't think it changed it enough, but that's another conversation. And our young people have really been leading organizers and art creators around that movement. So we are a social justice organization that's about providing political education and transformational services to young people. We are committed to training the field, and then we are committed to changing the conditions. And I know that's what we'll be talking about today, that our young people are forced to endure. The last point I'd make on this kind of introductory piece is, you mentioned Integrate NYC. Brotherhood Sister Sol is part of an effort with Integrate NYC, Girls for Gender Equity, and Make the Road, a youth-run, 4-organization-led effort to increase the number of mental health providers and guidance counselors in our schools. It's really an abomination what we allow to continue. Many electeds have taken this on, most notably Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer. But right now in our schools, the average is 1 guidance counselor per 400 young people. And that's an aggregate. Again, to Brad's point, it's very different from school to school. In some schools, it's 1 to 1,500. And so there's a mental health crisis across economic strata, across ethnicity, across race with young people today. They need counselors to talk to. 1 to 400 is horrible. 1 to 1,500 is horrific. And what we know is that when our schools reopen post-COVID, hopefully in the fall, the trauma that young people are facing, disproportionately Black and brown low-income young people, will mean they're almost even more in need, or they are almost more in need of support. And so we cannot return to business as usual within our schools. I do believe this is a moment when we have to really take on these large issues. And so I'm excited to talk about it today with all of
you. Jose, give us your who you are. I already know, because he and I chatted for a few minutes. He's been teaching for 15 years, which is already deserves some kind of Medal of Honor. But tell us a little bit about yourself, where you teach, not during COVID, and what led you to found EduColor and what it does.
Well, my name is Jose Vilson. I've been teaching for the better part of 15 years, as you mentioned. By day, I'm a teacher of students with a focus on math. Notice I'm not saying a math teacher, because I believe in that student relationship. And that forms the bedrock by which I actually teach math. And I've been doing that in IX 52, Harold O'Leary School 52, Uptown, Washington Heights, for the entirety of my career since I was young. And obviously, currently I'm doing remote, or what I've been calling disaster distance learning for this time period. And that's been a whole set of levers that I've had to pull in terms of this conversation around equity. So that's one element. And then, by evening, I'm also the author of This Is Not a Test, a new narrative on race, class, and education. And I'm the co-founder and executive director of EduColor, which is an organization dedicated to race and social justice issues in education. So some of the things that we do is we provide on and offline supports for any number of educators to get on this anti-racism train, to get on this equity train, to really have conversations around professional development, to actually be able to advocate for students through policy and practice and research. We've been privileged to partner up with any number of organizations, including TED, the U.S. Department of Education, prior to this administration, obviously, and then any number of other organizations that have been very interested in trying to get equity-minded educators to get on this boat. And I've also had the privilege of having any number of my students actually be part of the Brotherhood Sister Sol. So obviously the connections are deep within all of us, and I'm blessed to be able to do this work. Thank you.
Ruth, you're muted.
You're on mute.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. You can hear me? Okay,
We
sorry.
can hear you well. Yep.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm interested in, for both of you, especially given what you just mentioned, Jose, about, because I think listeners would be interested in this, about how you find your students. I don't mean in terms, I just mean in terms of their awareness of these issues. So, I mean, I guess in one way it's a little different by the time you get to Brother and Sister Sol there, you reach out to them, but our kids, I know my perception, but our kids in general, Brad, actually it's a question I guess for you, because I know your daughter's sort of mid-school life. Are kids in general aware of the inequities in the school system? But more importantly, are kids of color aware that of these gross inequities inequities and of the additional challenges they face, and they come to you with a concern, etc.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned all that
Go ahead,
because
Jose.
thank you. It's because I think we severely underestimate the power of student agency and voice. As someone who is a father of an 8-year-old, for example, he's very quick to remind people within his own class. It's like he knows who has what type of computer, who has what type of internet access, who hasn't been logging on in his morning meetings with his own teacher. And so if he's able to recognize that at 8 years old, I could only imagine the sort of articulation that comes out of kids who are in the high school level. I know for my own students, I've had kids who wake up at all times of day, go to sleep at all times of night. So I'm getting assignments literally like at 12 o'clock at midnight. So I know what's going on during the day when like they can't maybe not concentrate when they're supposed to doing like normal school hours. Kids who are literally like starving until like their mom says, go get the food from, such and such place. And we're fortunate in New York City to have, schools actually become these food centers for so many of our children because they really need it, even though they don't tell it to their friends, but they're very quick to tell me or like tell somebody else very quickly, like, hey, like I need that help. They're so, I think something that's really frustrating for them is obviously not necessarily having the full language and the full breadth and not having the full understanding of like what policies have led up to this point, but for them to be able to recognize that inequity immediately, they do so and have done so since pre-COVID. I think this situation has only exacerbated the situation, not necessarily, I mean, it's exposed it, but even more so because so many of them are like, oh, wow. So we don't have the things that private schools have where, they're able to get any number of resources. They have parents who are more likely to be essential workers as well. So they know what that looks like as well. They know that everybody keeps talking about gaps and how they need to fill in gaps, even though, frankly, we don't really need to be talking about gaps. We need to be talking about where we meet students and how to elevate from there. So the kids are super sharp about a lot of this and probably even more eloquent than a lot of adults.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are kind of two answers to the question, I think, Ruth. I mean, the young people at Brosis who are working to politicize, to create spaces for them to speak up, they've done a profound job on that. I mean, I've mentioned already one collaborative they're a part of. Another issue they've really tried to take on has been the policing in our schools. There's more police and police employees in our public schools than there are police in any city in America other than Chicago and Los Angeles. Just to think about the police presence in our school is profoundly disturbing. And of course, we know that those police are almost all in heavily Black and brown, low-income schools. So again, to the council members' statement, it's really about a tale of multiple cities. I'm not sure it's two cities. I would say it's more like our educational system is essentially a caste system with multiple layers of schools, from phenomenal schools to holding facilities at the bottom of what we look at. The high school graduation rate is often touted at 70%. Two successive administrations, Bloomberg and de Blasio, celebrate that number. I don't know how you go to sleep at night if that's the number, because it represents hundreds of thousands of children not graduating. But that's an aggregate again. There are communities where the high school graduation rate is 99%. In our community, it's lower than 50% in the Harlem community. And so when you look at those realities, I don't think it's a question of are young people aware? I don't think most New Yorkers are aware. I think most New Yorkers are not aware of the horrific segregation in our schools, that New York was named again. I do a lot of talking about these issues. I talk with supporters and donors and friends, people of great compassion, people of great moral fiber who have no idea about this issue. And when we start talking about it and they hear that we live in a city where the city schools have been deemed the most segregated in America, they're stunned. When they hear about the level of inequity that's going on in our schools, they're often stunned. And I think there are two things that run up against each other, is the gross inequality in our schools and then the size and scope of our schools. So the answers have to be really massive. I mean, when you're talking about a school system with a budget of $34 billion and 1.1 million children, then the response to inequity in that system is entirely different than Washington, D.C. with a system of 50,000. So the two things that are facing us are the horrific inequality of our schools, and then the magnitude of the number of people we serve. And in turn, what does that response need to be? And I don't think most New Yorkers are aware of it. Clearly, successive mayors have not really run on this issue or tackled this issue. They've done a piecemeal approach, whether it's closing schools of the Bloomberg philosophy or pre-K of the de Blasio. Those are small pieces of a much larger issue. And I just think most New Yorkers are not aware of it. I think they're intimidated by the problem. And I think, again, to Brad's earlier comments, it also forces us to question at times, what does it mean to be a New Yorker? What will you do to break down lines of segregation? What will you do to speak out about these issues of inequity? Because sometimes it's going to come back and affect the education of all children, including your own children. And then that becomes a third rail in this conversation.
So let me build on that to kind of ask the question that it implies about what we should be doing. I think we can dig more down into, helping, and if people have questions about it, helping people really see the inequity. But let's, for a minute, take it as a given and talk about what we do about it. And I think both of you have a lot of, moral credibility here, because you both help people develop consciousness about the system, but then also help kids in their individual lives and are, so, I guess one is, I'm curious, you can think more broadly, you don't have to respond to this prompt, but, I think an interesting challenge in the dynamic around segregation and integration is, there's sort of an integration model. You could imagine integrating our schools. You could use a set of practices, abolishing gifted and talented, changing district lines, using school assignment policies. And you could imagine integrating New York City's schools. That would be very ambitious, but you could do it. I think I know you both also take a kind of consciousness raising approach grounded more in also Pan-African and our schools don't need, it's not the presence of white bodies near African-American and Latino kids. So it ought to be possible to build schools that have, that build from the communities that folks are in to be powerful and equal. So, you don't have to you can either talk about sort of that tension and how you think about it, but I guess in the context of if you were advising the mayor, take the problem seriously, and what would it take to have educational justice? What would what would that look like? What would you recommend? That's a big question. So, whichever of you wants to jump in.
Jose, you want to go first? I'm happy to answer it too.
Okay. I work under the philosophy that New York City parents generally are of the belief that they may want equal schools, but they want some schools to be more equal than others. And unfortunately, that's the reality is there's always this constant push, whether it's through any number of websites that review schools or gifted and talented programs or any of that sort of stuff. They want to see that everybody kind of gets good school, but they want to make sure that their specific child's school has an individual advantage that can make their child have a higher probability of success and mobility in the future. And so if we're able to disillusion people from the idea that their one child is the only child that matters in a school system of 1.1 million children, not to mention the tens of thousands of other children that are in our private school, independent school, and religious school system, then we need to find a way to do that and talk about that in principle. Obviously, a lot of that starts with dissolving the idea of specialized high schools, even if they are more art inclined or whatever inclined, being able to remove a lot of those barriers matters a lot. That's a big policy, but then going down to the gifted and talented programs, breaking all that down, and then being able to then target any number of businesses that profit off of the numbers, the large numbers of tests that are out there that implicitly give advantages to children who are more well off or who are more willing to sacrifice for one exam versus just making sure that everybody's able to get a great, solid education from any number of public schools that are out there. Even when we talk about these conversations around gifted and talented and whatever have you, a lot of that comes with the test. Abolishing the test and saying, hey, what would it look like if schools actually graded children across a spectrum of work and a spectrum of really awesome work, and value the work that people do within the school system, and then actually rethink the idea of what it means to be intelligent in our school system. Is it a narrow thing where everybody who passes the test are the only folks who deserve a quality building, who deserve high technology and high internet capabilities? Or is it going to be something where everyone is able to get that regardless and because of where they come from? And I would actually suggest the schools that are most vulnerable need even more of what we have in terms of our population. And of course, this also speaks kind of to what Khary was talking about, which is like, we need to talk about income inequality in our city. And the fact that we do have a real caste system means that even our visions and ideas of what we consider the American dream kind of belie the idea that really we are probably at the worst point in terms of our economic disparities in our city. So people who are poor often stay poor. People who make it to the middle class don't necessarily have a likelihood of staying in that middle class if they're Black or brown. Like, even if they get rich, there is still that likely probability that they may fall down a caste, depending on, you know, whether what their race and their gender and their class is. So all this is really tied to any number of factors that we consider to be great about our city. Our city is not doing as well because of these very factors. So schooling is tied to any number of economic, social, health factors that are out there. We need to be able to address that and advocate for that from our points of privilege.
Yeah, I want to, Khary, I want to turn to you. I just was going to say one thing, because you both, and I think we all agree, many of these facts that are absolute facts are not known to most people. Either they don't know them or they don't want to know them. But I would just point out that since we have a school system of over 1 million children, it's astounding how little coverage there is of what actually happens in the school system in the New York media. And I mention that because Jose was just talking about testing. It just happens, and maybe Tess can find it and post it after the program, but in the Boston Globe, Boston, not a city known for integration, but in the Boston Globe this past week, there was an amazing story of just the Boston Globe following 3 middle school kids about the test for the specialized high school. And it was just trying to highlight some of the race and class issues just by telling 3 stories. It was a far less than perfect story, and it was focused on a specialized test to get into a specialized school. But it began to sort of show that you know, we live for sure, these ongoing clear class and race disparities that in New York don't get talked about in the papers. Khary?
I mean, I think on that point, Ruth, Jose mentions the independent school system. You know, there's over 200,000 kids attending the independent school system. I would submit that if there was one public school system in this city, no Catholic school system, no independent school system, private schools with over 200,000, and everybody had to attend public schools, that the attention on the issue would be much, much more substantial, and that our schools would be significantly improved. I don't think it would be a panacea, but part of the reason that administrations have been able to evade this issue is because the schools are disproportionately serving Black and brown and low-income people. And the reality is that that's acceptable for that population by a lot of those in power in the city. There's really no way to evade that. And people may send their children to public school for elementary school and then send them to private school, or they may test into Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, and that's not the same thing as going to traditional public school. It's great, it's free, it's public, I get it, but it's not quite the same thing, right? Public does not mean, just one thing. So I think part of it is a money issue, as much as people hear about the size of the budget. So to answer Brad's point, New York City is spending roughly $24,000 per pupil right now in DOE. Private schools are at $50,000. So when, what parents are doing is throwing their money, wealthy parents of means, they're throwing their money at the problem. They're spending $50,000 a year at a private school to educate their child, and that's just the baseline. Then there's all the extra things, the tutoring, the travel, the other things that get thrown in to supporting the intellectual development of a child in high school. I'm on 2 boards that really kind of, come together on this issue in interesting ways. So I'm on the board of trustees of Community Service Society, which is one of the leading anti-poverty organizations in the city, probably the leading anti-poverty policy organization. And, they have deemed that 1/3 of all New Yorkers live in poverty or on the poverty line. So you're talking about nearly 3 million people living in poverty or on the poverty line and lacking all the kind of supports that Jose is talking about. Because the issue of poverty and segregation is not a school issue, it's a city issue. And if you're living in a segregated community, if you're living in a low-income community, then your health outcomes, your employment possibilities, everything from food to transportation is affected. So that when that child finally arrives at school, she or he is carrying all of that with him or her. I'm also on the board of the Ethical Culture Vilson Schools, which is, one of the elite private schools in the country. And I see what $50,000 a year buys for parents within that school. And the disparate support is striking. So it's a multi-pronged issue. And I think if a mayor wanted to take this on to kind of answer specifically Brad's question, we really need the often, referenced Marshall Plan for public schools in this city. And we need to tackle all the tangents that we know affect education. We can't improve our schools if we don't deal with segregated housing. We can't deal with our schools if we don't deal with what's happening in NYCHA. We can't deal with our schools if we don't look at our schools in a new way. Our schools are still based on this agrarian model from 100 years ago. What should the school day look like? What should the calendar year look like? I believe you need medical health professionals in every school to deal with some of the poverty-specific health outcomes that are right now exacerbating COVID. It's the same thing in schools. We have kids missing school because of asthma, because they don't have access to the medicine or a nurse practitioner. Our schools need that kind of baseline medical support and mental health support for young people. 15 years ago, roughly, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity decision was handed down, which was the state decision that found that there was not a common or equal education being provided. And it found that in low-income schools in New York City, those schools had dilapidated buildings, the worst technology, the least prepared teachers, and that's where the need was greatest. And so are we ensuring that the teachers are equally prepared and that you're not getting teachers with 6 weeks of training going into a low-income South Bronx school and somebody else who's a master teacher for 20 years doing wonderful work in a middle-class community? We need to ensure that the teaching and administration is consistent. And I think the reason that no mayoral administration has really tackled this issue is because to tackle it means you have to take on issues of economic inequality in this city that are extremely broad. And only by tackling those can you also tackle what's going on in the school. And I just don't think people have had the stomach to do it. I don't think they've had, quite honestly, the backbone to do it. And until we do, be narrow bites at the fringe of this issue, until we really tackle the substantive issue of inequality, which affects a child's life at every point. She comes to school, she faces inequality. She walks on streets home, she faces inequality. She goes to her housing project, she faces inequality. Food is put on the table, she faces inequality. That's the issue that the city has to tackle. And then I think the kind of the boats of education will rise.
Jose, I'm going to give you a narrower question for a minute, but I'd just love for you to pick up. You are in a school. You've been in schools for 15 years. Say something about, not for you, because we can all hear that, but the motivation for teachers, the experience of teachers, and the issue that Khary raised earlier about the lack of social work, guidance counselor, mental health people in the schools, and what does that do to the job of the teacher?
I think I'll try to keep it, so I'll keep it focused because, as you're well aware, living in a neighborhood that is very similar to the ones that my own students are, also live in, gives me an inside perspective that maybe a lot of folks don't. I wake up every morning, and, only recently did this not happen, but I was waking up every morning to the sound of sirens. I'm listening about every 6 to 10 times a day to sirens just blaring over and over. And, that just having that alone makes it hard for students to attend a live meeting. Like that's a very simple element of this, right? The fact that I literally had a student maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago tell me that they would have loved to do my assignments, but their father just passed away from COVID because they was an essential worker. And she was only able to confess that to me because I had built such a strong relationship with her from September to March. And, me having to jump into action and calling any number of counselors, I literally was on the horn with like the guidance counselor and the principal being like, hey, like this actually happens, and what do we have to respond to this? If we didn't have that sort of response already in hand, I can imagine how much more difficult it would have been for me to address that right then and there. So our school is blessed because we do have a partnership with Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in our own building, and we have nurses and I guess psychologists and other psychiatrists and other folks like that within our building. And so from September to March, we were literally sending kids maybe 4 or 5 times a day, like to these services, just trying to make sure that they were okay, because we know for a fact that relationships are such a critical part to what we consider professionalism and expertise. Being able to say, hey, like, how are you doing before, hey, can you complete my assignment, is such a big part to the work that we do on a daily basis. And so what I often tell people is like, if you're going to address students' social emotional health, that actually improves outcomes for so many of our students, because how many of them are actually going to consider what you're teaching if they don't trust you with their beings, if they don't trust you with their selves? I think to so many of our people constantly want to talk about the academic part, which is incredibly important, and it's important for accountability reasons amongst other reasons. But I'll also suggest that in a time like this, I think people started to awaken to the idea that perhaps focusing in on those social emotional components, including, you know, the restorative justice elements, the idea that we need to actually make sure that students do get dental, that they do get physicals, that they do get vaccines, that they get any number of health services given to them, will actually help them focus in the classroom. So many of our students, for example, I have a class now that, you know, we were starting to refer to get glasses. People said, wait, why would you do that? And, you know, people thought that they were just unfocused and unmotivated. And I said, no, actually, they just have a hard time seeing, right? And we know where they're coming from. We know the neighborhoods that they're sitting in. And yet people kept not addressing it, because it was much easier to say, hey, like, they're just unmotivated and we don't really need to worry about them, versus saying, I noticed something that you really just want me to have you in the front of the room, not because you want to hear me, but because you can't see. You literally cannot see what's going on. So when we started to address that, the outcome started to become better. I literally said, you know what, forgo the desk. Everybody sit on the floor right near my board, because I had maybe 16 kids who couldn't see well. But I think within that, I was able to come up with a temporary relief until we were able to address that. And then, of course, you know, COVID came, and I think there's any number of issues with that. But to that end, being able to see teachers as that first set of responders for our children is so critical to this too. Saying to ourselves, the adults that are in that room need to be well equipped to not just deal with the academics, but also the social emotional components, or at least be very good at making referrals to the proper professionals, is so critical to what we talk about when we say equity, period.
Can you say a little more? I've become a big believer in like social and emotional learning and restorative practices, but I think those might be buzzwords for people who, you know, like knew what it's like to like learn math or diagram a sentence, but don't necessarily know what that really like means to do. Can you just flesh that out a little? Like what?
Okay, so in a normal school day, right? I think there's the first things first, right? Like, I am of the belief that students can't trust you with their brains if they don't trust you with their minds and hearts and bodies, right? Like, there is a sense of self-actualization that matters when you build relationships. So the student isn't going to trust you with, let's say, whatever math problem it is, if they don't think that you actually care about them as people. And so that actually cuts across race, class, gender, any number of things, because when the adult in front of you actually cares about you, then students feel more motivated to do the thing that you're asking them to do. I mean, that's just, it sounds simple, but it really is very much something that I've been leaning into. So here's some things that I do on a very practical level. One, I try my best to outright eliminate, if not bring down, the number of referrals I make on a daily basis to the dean, because you already know what happens when that occurs. It becomes, oh, let me refer you to the dean. Oh, you're going to constantly be in trouble. Oh, you're going to be suspended. Oh, you're going to miss class. What I do instead is, I see a behavior that's not necessarily what we have in line, and I say, why is that happening? And so I try to ask the student to step to the side with me. Let's have a conversation and just hear them out. And oftentimes you hear things like, oh, I'm hungry. I didn't get breakfast. I had somebody else yell at me. I didn't get good rest. And so when I hear those things, I then say, oh, so these are the situations that are going on. And then, of course, I then level that with, these are the expectations of my class. And here's the way I'm going to be able to support you. So I'll say things like, okay, so you need a 5-minute break. Go take some water. Oh, we have, the assistant principal may have snacks. Go see them. Oh, do you need me to talk to your parents so we can work out a situation that will allow you to finish this work in your time? Then let's do that. And I think just those very practical things where we actually say to ourselves, we put the relationships in front of the things that we normally would ask, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that, makes it so much more simple to like have the restorative conversation. Even when I have students fight amongst each other, I actually pull those two students, and I know I'm bigger, so maybe like there is that element as well. But being able to say like, hey, I need you two to talk to me right now. Like, what's going on? I try to work it out within my class so I don't have to make that referral. And I think students seeing that I'm able to handle the problem in my own classroom within that community makes that community more solid, because it actually makes the focal point more about the relationships between student to student instead of having an adult constantly intervening between how we can resolve conflicts.
We work at a school, Epic North in Queens, and we worked there for about 4 years. We had staff embedded in the school, and the principal at the time, there's been transition of leadership. Back to one of your earlier questions, Brad, I think that's a big issue with our schools, is the lack of consistency in leadership in our schools. Just when something's working well, there's a turnover in leadership. But within this school, we were there for 4 years, and the principal had 0 suspensions. And he attributed 0 suspensions to our rites of passage program in the school, which, if you use another terminology, would be restorative justice. And just as a kind of quick example to take through the real life lived reality of how our schools are different. You take a situation where Jose and I are 2 high school students, we're playing basketball and we get into a fight. Not a pushing fight, but a real fight. We throw punches at each other. Depending on the school you're in, the restorative justice approach would be for a teacher to separate us, talk to us, mediate it, maybe come up with something that we have to do. Maybe we have to clean the gym together. Maybe we have to write a letter of apology to each other. Maybe we have to stand up in our class and speak about it. That's restorative justice. And in one school, that's the response. In a second school, to Jose's point, it may be written up and you may be sent to a dean and you may be suspended. In another school, you may be suspended and have a superintendent suspension because of violence in the school. And now you're out of school for a long period of time. And in another school, a principal may use the NYPD staff in that school to manage that situation. And in turn, there are situations where kids are arrested. So the same fight results in 4 completely different responses. And again, if you're Black, if you're brown, if you're male, if you're large, the response is going to be very, very different than it's going to be if you are white and a woman and small in stature. All these things apply, and then class applies. But that's just an example of what restorative justice can be and what a proper response would be. And I think all parents know what that is. You know the different tools you use to train your children. It's the same thing in a school. And the problem is that they keep using the same tool in certain schools. And that tool is a tool that is not about the development of young people. It's about control and order.
Karen Scher has a question in the Q&A that I think really builds on this, which is, all right, so given that, how can schools, I guess individually, but also how can the system do better at training and supporting teachers in, trauma-informed practices and some of the sorts of things that you're doing? How, what's going on that might help genuinely scale that in general, and obviously given COVID?
Jose, you're teaching every day. You want to take the teacher training one first?
I think for me, here's the thing that I know Khary's going to speak to this very well, because I'm familiar with some of the students who come out because they've been my students, and they're like, oh, like it's in the parabeing program, so listen to him as well. But for me, I recognize that a lot of people like to blame this situation on teacher education programs. But what people need to really focus on is actually that continual PD, that what happens on the day-to-day basis and actually reacting right then and there to what's happening. The meetings that we have with adults should no longer be these boring sit, 1 hour sit meetings. Like we just sit through it and we just get a whole bunch of PowerPoints and then that's it. It needs to be actionable and practical on a daily basis. That's something that we can consistently have conversations about. So if a situation arises, we should have already had a response that we already had learned and we already saw happen in front of us before students even came into the building. And then 2, when it does happen, we as adults need to find a way to remind each other of the things that we had discussed in order to make it restorative. That's 2. And then 3, we as adults need to have better conversations with children. I think we severely lack the ability to see children as equal human beings who deserve rights as well. And it's not to say that everybody's perfect. To the contrary, because we are imperfect beings, we ought to be able to develop better conversations with children about what they did, how they did it, why they came to the decisions that they came, whether it was positive or negative, whatever that interaction was that got to the point where we have to implement some sort of restorative justice. That sort of even talk needed to be something that we preempt. We already say, hey, I love every single body here. I care about each and every one of you. And should it ever occur or ever arise that we get to a point where we have to implement something, where we have a conflict, then here are the ways that I'm going to handle this conflict. So you're very clear. So we're going to have the conversation outside. I am not going to be afraid to bring in the parent to have the conversation with you as well. But I do care about you, and I care about your educational and social emotional well-being. Like, being able to say that as an adult is both humbling, but also strong in that way. Being able to just say, hey, I have a framework that makes sure that you are a full human being and that I want you to learn. Like, people lose that. They don't have that in their classrooms because they feel like they have to, portray a sort of teacher that, is strong and strong-willed and heavy-handed, instead of saying, how can we interact better so that when you go out into the quote-unquote real world, you're able to interact in a way that assures that you're still successful in that way, and it's able to bring peace to your community, to your world as well.
So we're getting a bunch of questions, which makes it clear we can't possibly get through all of this. Let me pose one, and then let me pose 2. One is, maybe before we end there, somebody has asked, if people were to leave this session and go do one thing to improve the schools, what would you tell them to do? So you could be thinking about that. But meanwhile, someone wrote in and asked if you would say something. I'm going to broaden out her question, but she asked if you would say something about the particular challenges to special education during the COVID crisis. And I'm going to actually ask you to take that a little bit broader. We flipped, I think, correctly to talking about ongoing education inequities in the city at a very, very gross level. And Jose, you talked eloquently about how some of what's happening in a school, or even when your kid notices, your 8-year-old, about the difference in how people are able to handle the online education. So I just would like each of you to say, like, it's clear schools are closed now for the end of the year. It's not clear if they'll open in September. What does this city need to do? I don't want to say post-COVID, but moving out of this crisis to pick up some of the pieces and start to just address education next year. That's one question. And then the other question is, what does the city need to do to change educational inequity? Those are small scale and large scale.
I've talked some about the large scale and the policy issues and the largeness of the problem. I also believe that, the personal story, the personal narrative really illustrates for many of us, allows us to connect with another's experience. In addition to this work, I'm a writer, and the novel that I wrote was about the experience of a young man who comes from deep family love, but every day that he leaves his house, he walks into the kind of socioeconomic conditions that Jose is talking about, and what that does to his psyche and the questions that he has to face each and every day. So 9 weeks ago, Brotherhood Sister Sol shut our doors for the first time in 25 years due to the COVID crisis. And we moved all of our support systems online. We're doing online tutoring and mentoring and guidance, et cetera. But let's talk about what one child is facing. So, the mayor announced that they had deemed 300,000 kids in need of computers. We always thought that was an undercount, but that was announced. After 6 weeks, 200,000 of those children still had not received computers. So we asked low-income children to learn remotely, and they had no computer. So that's problem number one. So we provided free computers and hotspots for our young people because they had not gotten them yet from DOE. So first off, you're asking people to do this without a computer. Well, then there's the issue of Wi-Fi. The best homes, the wealthiest homes have issues with Wi-Fi. Everybody probably on this call has cursed their Wi-Fi one time or another. Ruth froze during this call, and I'm sure you've got great Wi-Fi in your house. Well, what happens when you have 5 or 6 people living in a 2-bedroom house and the Wi-Fi is shaky and multiple children are trying to access the same Wi-Fi to learn? So now the Wi-Fi is an issue. We asked our young people what was the most critical need in their life, and they said food. And so for the last 7 weeks, we've been providing food for our young people, and we've provided over 15,000 meals in the last 7 weeks. So if you don't have access to a computer, and your Wi-Fi is shaky at best, or maybe it's been cut off, and you don't have sufficient food in your house, and now people are saying, go learn from Jose. Jose may be the greatest math teacher who's ever walked this earth. Let's assume that he is, okay? If a child is coming then without technology and Wi-Fi and food in their stomach, if there's trauma in the house because people have lost their jobs, how is that person supposed to learn? And so I have good friends who come from wealthy backgrounds, whose children are at elite schools, and they are done with the remote learning that their kids are getting because this is a difficult medium to teach people. But it's even more difficult if you don't have a computer, Wi-Fi, or food in your belly. And so we have to start there about how difficult COVID has been and the inequalities that this has cracked open. These inequalities are always here, but what COVID has done is just made so bare the realities that young kids who are coming from economically distressed backgrounds are facing, that they can't even take advantage of the remote learning that they're being asked to take advantage of. And so those are the kind of realities that our kids are dealing with. It's why we've had to step into this space to do more. But COVID has just revealed even more deeply the inequality that our children are facing.
Jose?
I mean, he hit everything. I'm always gonna say too, because of the type of community-based organization that BroSis is, being able to listen to student voice and agency and all this is so critical. I'm seeing, for example, a conversation in the chat about what the governor and the mayor have done, and yet I have yet to see people actually reimagine education with students on those boards. You're seeing panels constantly pop up of experts, and but who are really the experts of education right now, if not the people who are actually being educated? I would constantly ask people to think about those who do advocate for children, which are folks like that are on this call, absolutely. And we also need to be able to recruit people who can actually speak to the education that they're receiving. So being able to say to ourselves, you know what, like, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to give up my seat so that this high schooler, this middle schooler, this elementary school child can actually speak to what's going on with their own experience and how we can reimagine education when we get into September. What will it look like, for example, for us to have a morning meeting when you have to stay 6 feet away up, left, right, front, or back of you, when generally elementary school kids get to huddle up, like they want to be in that closed space so that they can actually build together. Those are going to be really critical elements, and I really hope we can take care of that thoroughly.
And I just want to underline here, and this kind of goes back to Khary's point about funding. We're not only are we not getting to this kind of big rethink that you guys are describing, but we are about to have a teacher hiring freeze, cut $100 million out of the classrooms, cut a significant number of the programs we're describing, and at the same time, the hiring freeze that covers the rest of New York City does not cover the NYPD. So we're going to hire 2,300 new cops next year under Mayor de Blasio's budget to the tune of, north of $100 million, while we cut substantially from the Department of Education. And then at the state level, the governor has made clear that he thinks it's a non-starter to do any of the kind of, progressive revenues, an ultra-millionaires tax, or closing the carried interest loophole, that would make it possible to even begin to fulfill the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit.
Right.
We don't have transformative vision, but we also just are denying the basic resources, even as we say we know the impacts of COVID are going to be. The mayor himself said, given how bad, education has been affected this year, next year has to be the best school year ever. But I mean, how could it be the best school year ever when we're already in advance cutting the budget, even with all those challenges, Jose, that you have articulated? So, I mean, I'm eager to hear what you guys think people should do if they could do one thing. But I guess one thing that I would urge people to do is let both your, local and state elected officials and the mayor and the governor know that, we can't go ahead and fully fund, 2,300 new cops while we're cutting the Department of Education. And that we need
and summer youth employment jobs, cutting summer youth employment jobs as well. I mean, I just want to underline something quickly that the council member said on a state level, since we know so much money comes from a state level. Again, I know this will, I'm sure, upset certain people on the Zoom as Governor Cuomo takes his victory laps, and people love listening to him each day. But the governor was faced with a very specific decision to make. And the decision was, just to name this, put forth by progressive elected officials on a state level to raise a tax on 125 people in the state of New York. That's option one. Option two was to cut Medicare and Medicaid when we need hospitals getting more support and low-income people getting more medical support than ever now, and cutting funding for hospitals in low-income areas, and in his own words, cutting drastically social services. That was his choice. And he made the latter choice. And we have to name that. We have to talk about that there is a choice being made to cut the most critical services when we need them. And so I just think we have to underline that point, because whether it's the mayor and the NYPD, or whether it's the governor and the cuts he's insisting on making, as opposed to raising revenue, this is going to have disastrous effects much longer than this fall.
You mentioned one thing, yeah? I would also suggest that people need to have the uncomfortable conversations with their friends and peers. I think too many of us who are in New York City want to be confrontational about subways, taxis, type of pizza they enjoy, the teams that they love, but never about the educational systems. They're very, I think too many of us are very inclined to say, hey, oh, that's your school, oh, that's great, I'm happy for you, and never seek to address that which makes us uncomfortable. Why do we have two schools in the same region, one that has all the funding they could possibly have, parent associations that grant upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure that kids can go to the DC and all these other trips, while the school maybe just next door or a couple doors away aren't able to have those same luxuries. That's really critical. And I think a lot of that is that foundational, that societal conversation that we need to have with one another. Very similar to a conversation we need to have about masking, right? If we can be uncomfortable about, suggesting to others, hey, you're not wearing a mask, please, we need you to wear one because everybody needs to get rid of this pandemic. It's very similar with educational inequality, and that's the one that's a little bit more virulent.
All right, you guys have been amazing. We knew when we started this that we needed 2 weeks to even begin to touch this issue. It's now clear we could do it all year. I think it's an issue that both Brad and I are passionate about. You've been wonderful about really, as you said just now, Jose, but both of you, how it really is, how it is, of course, with the impact of the pandemic, but as Khary said, what's there all the time, and what people need to understand when they think about the future of the city for themselves, for their families, for their communities, or for everybody. So for sure, Tess will pick up some things that you said. We'll mention both of your books in the follow-up mailing and let people know how to get further engaged and involved. But I think right now I want to thank each of you, one in the classroom, one as a social justice organizer, for what you're doing to expose educational inequity and try to correct for it, from the individual child to the system as a whole. We are indebted to each of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very kindly.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. More on educational inequity next week.
Yes.
Yeah, these two are really fantastic, and it was so great to hear from you both. But I will say, if anyone can deliver in following up, Mark Griffith and Emma Rayhock at least have a chance, I think, to keep us going. So please tune in then as well. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much.